So, hi, I have the honor of being with two great personalities. Grant Gochin, who is a guy who is suing the government of Lithuania, and Silvia Foti, who wrote a book that is now translated into Spanish about El General Storm, and it's about her grandfather. She discovered her grandfather was a Nazi. Please, Grant, if you can tell us your story, uh, how you met
Okay.
Sylvia, and what do you do?
Okay. So first of all, thank you so much for having us on. It really is an honor and a privilege to be on your show, and I'm grateful to you for helping us tell our story. So my story begins from birth. Three of my grandparents were from Lithuania and the regions. And when I was growing up, my grandfather always used to tell me stories about when he was growing up in Lithuania. And when Lithuania was liberated from the Soviets, my grandfather had already died. And I wanted to go and see where he had been born. And he'd always said to me, one day, if I ever have the ability to go to Lithuania, I should please go and say Kaddish at his family's graves. So I was one of the very, very first people to go to Lithuania when it was liberated from the Soviets. And it was fascinating. And I kept going back and back and back. And the Jewish cemeteries were desecrated. The gravestones had been stolen. The graves had been dug up looking for gold fillings. There really wasn't much of anything. And I wanted to set things right and record history. And one day I was in my grandfather's village, and in his village, there are 3 death pits. And I was with an academic, and I said, who did the killings? You know, there were thousands of Jews here. Who actually shot the guns? Who rounded them up, suffocated the babies, raped the woman? Who took them to the death pits and actually murdered them? And the academic looked at me and said, it was a man by the name of Jonas Noreka. So I came back to the United States. I live in Los Angeles. I came back and I wanted to learn what makes somebody turn into a mass genocidal murderer. Why would he go and murder my cousins? What had the babies done to Jonas Noreka that he wanted to murder them? And I started researching Jonas Noreka. Now, Lithuania got its independence in 1990, but in 1984, Germany had exposed Jonas Noreka as the murderer in my grandfather's village and in those areas. So even before Lithuania received independence, it was widely known that Jonas Noreka was the murderer. And I started researching him more and more and more. And I discovered that he's one of Lithuania's greatest national heroes. So I'm sitting there and I'm thinking, well, this is crazy. You know, the Jews were Lithuanian citizens. They were just citizens that happened to be Jewish. So if somebody had come in and murdered thousands of Lithuanian citizens just because they wanted to kill and slaughter and murder, Lithuania wouldn't honor the murder of their own citizens as a national hero. So I'm sitting there thinking, okay, there's a mistake here. Maybe the government of Lithuania made an error and doesn't know that maybe they hadn't read the German reports. So I started contacting the government of Lithuania and saying, you've made a mistake. There's something wrong over here. Do you know that Noreika was a murderer and you honoring him? And all I got back was lies and dishonesty and more lies. And I thought, it can't be. There's people over here that are honoring murderers of their own citizens. So I thought, well, maybe the government doesn't know. So I started contacting the president's office, and she just pushed me away. I contacted the prime minister's office. They pushed me away. I contacted the parliament. They pushed me away. And I kept on at this for years and years and years, saying, it's not possible that you're doing this. Anyway, in 2015, 19 of Lithuania's leading academics, including a member of their government, submitted a petition to the government saying, stop faking history. Stop honoring murderers of Jews as your heroes. And the government of Lithuania responded that these were Soviet agents, that enemies of the state, Jews, and other stupid people.
Okay.
And they completely rejected, including from their own member of the European Parliament, including the president of Vilnius University that signed this petition. So these were not low people. And I discovered through this whole process that it wasn't just Jonas Noreika that they were honoring. They had a whole lot of murderers that they were honoring as their citizens. That it was this huge program to turn murderers into national history, into national heroes, and deny their crimes. So eventually, I said, it can't be. I'm meeting so much dishonesty, so much Holocaust revisionism. And this is a country that's in the European Union and a member of NATO. It's supposed to be an ally of the United States. And they have a whole government department just to commit Holocaust fraud. So I contacted a lawyer. A lot of lawyers I contacted refused to take the case. And eventually I found a lawyer in Lithuania that accepted the case, and we sued the government. And that was a learning experience, because we discovered that the courts in Lithuania are not independent. They rule as they're instructed to rule, and they were instructed not to rule for a Jew against their heroes. And so we sued. I sued multiple times. And, the courts have been in lockstep. They are not willing to look at the facts of the case. The criminal authorities are not willing to look they have a law against Holocaust denial, but it's just a law on the books. It's not actually a law to be applied. So one day I'm sitting at my desk at this very computer that you see right there, and emails pop up. I don't know how to turn the alerts off. I need some young technology kid to come show me how to turn these alerts off. And one day I'm sitting in this chair at my desk right here, and an alert pops up on my screen. And I look at the email, and it says, "Hello, Mr. Gochin. My name is Silvia Foti. I assume you know who I am. My hands started shaking. My skin turned, I started sweating. because of course I knew who Silvia Foti was. Silvia Foti is the granddaughter of the Nazi that murdered all of my cousins. She is the granddaughter of the person my grandfather used to have nightmares about every night of his life. So I'm sitting there, I'm shaking like this. And I couldn't focus when Silvia. So I had to reply to her. I didn't know what she wants. I was completely suspicious of her. So I replied, yes, I'd like to talk to you, but I need a few days because I needed time to calm down. And I said, let's schedule a time to talk. So I've made all of my research public. You know, he didn't only murder my cousins, he murdered lots of people's cousins. And there were 220,000 Jews murdered in Lithuania. And the murderers are their national heroes. So I couldn't keep this data private. I had to make it public because it applies to all Jews. So I make an appointment to talk to Silvia, and Silvia calls me, and now I'm deeply suspicious. I don't know what this woman wants. I don't know if she's going to say, well, she's going to do what her grandfather did and come for the rest of my cousins. So I pick up the phone and I say hello, and I wasn't that pleasant because I was so suspicious. And she says to me, Mr. Gochin, I've read all of your research. And I'm like, yeah, so you're going to argue? You're going to do what? She says, I just want to let you know you've made a very big mistake in your research. And I'm sitting there thinking, okay, you know, here comes the Nazi garbage. And so I said, what? I mean, I wasn't even pleasant. I was just like abrasive and rude. And I said, what? So she said, you've missed about 10,000 of my grandfather's victims. And when she said that, all the suspicions just disappeared. I knew I was talking to somebody that was honest and real. And so, Silvia, why don't I hand it to you and you carry on?
Okay. So the story for me also started almost from birth because I grew up hearing wonderful stories about my grandfather. I'm in Chicago, and I grew up in Market Park, which had the largest number of Lithuanians outside of Lithuania. And, you know, pretty much from since I could talk and understand, my mother and my grandmother, his wife, have been talking about my grandfather. And I learned that he was a wonderful hero in Lithuania, and that he fought against the communists very bravely. And he fought against them twice. And the communists caught him. And then they brought him to the KGB prison, where they tortured him for 2 years. And then they executed him. And he was only 36 years old. Before that, he was in a Nazi concentration camp. And the version I heard was he was in a Nazi concentration camp because he tried to save so many Jews. And he was tortured in the Nazi concentration camp for 2 years. So, and then before that, he was head of the Šiauliai district, which was during the Nazi occupation. But he was kind of acting as a double agent, you know, trying to help Lithuania and the Jews while he could. And then before that, he led an uprising against the communists when they first invaded Lithuania in 1940. And the uprising happened in 1941. And he won the country back from the communists. And I heard, you know, he was a journalist, he was a writer, very good looking man. My grandmother had his portrait in her living room. We had it in our dining room and living room next to a crucifix, you know. And so in my mind, you know, he was practically God. Like, he was just a legend. And so my mother had been working on a story about him. The Lithuanian community here in Chicago asked her to write a story about him and to write a book about him. And so the daughter was going to write the definitive biography of her father. And she had started in the 1970s. I was a teenager then. And she just kept collecting and collecting and collecting material. And then very late in life, she got a PhD in literature, which I believe was so that she could write this story. Well, now she's 60 years old, and now it's the year 2000, and she still has not written this book. And she goes to the hospital. She had diabetes, and she had a back pain. And so she was in and out of the hospital all the time for this test and that test. And I thought it was, you know, another regular hospital visit. And I went to visit her in late January. And today's the day she died, 21 years ago, February 4th.
Wow.
Wow.
It was February 4th. I woke up with that, and I hadn't thought about it all day until right now. So she died 21 years ago today. So anyway, she's in the hospital. And she looked horrible. She looked terrible. And I knew this is going to be bad. I still wasn't sure she was going to die, but I was really, really, really worried. And she says, Sylvia, come over here. She takes my hand and she says, you have to write the book. And of course I knew what book she was talking about, because that's all she ever talked about. And I couldn't accept the fact that she was dying, because I knew that's the only reason she would even ask me to do this. And I said, no, you're going to do it. Everything's going to be fine. And she said, please, you have to do it. Everybody expects it. This was her lifelong mission, and she could not die without making sure that her lifelong mission had been passed on to me, to someone. And I was the natural candidate because I was a journalist then, and I was a writer, and I was into his story. She told me a lot of things about him. So I said yes. And then she closed her eyes, and then I left her room and thinking she'll bounce back. But then the next day I came back and she was in a coma. So that's it. Deathbed promise. And then she died 2 weeks later on February 4th, 2000. So of course I was grief stricken and, you know, just very, very sad. But eventually I started to embrace the story, thinking, okay, it'll be a nice connection to my mother. It'll be a nice connection to my grandfather. Maybe, you know, this is a blessing. If I have to have, you know, my mother, who passed away, at least maybe this is a gift that she left for me. And so I collected all the material, and behind me are 3 bookshelves, and it's all the stuff that she collected and that I brought to my house here. And it's 3,000 pages of KGB transcripts, because when he was in the KGB, the Soviets interrogated him, and they wrote down what happened during those interrogations. So my mother got those transcripts and translated them from Russian to Lithuanian. And so I spent a long time reading them.
So you speak Lithuanian?
I speak Lithuanian. I grew up speaking Lithuanian. I went to kindergarten. I couldn't speak English because that's all it was in my house. It was just Lithuanian. And we were in a Lithuanian community. All my friends were Lithuanian. All my parents' friends were Lithuanian. So when I went to kindergarten, I couldn't speak English. So then it's July. And 5 months later, and now my grandmother, who survived my mother, his wife, had a heart attack. And now she's on her deathbed. And she calls me over and she takes my hand and says, Sylvia, don't write the book.
Okay.
I'm like, what do you mean don't write the book? And she says, just let history lie. There's no need to dig around. And I said, well, of course I'm going to write the book. I mean, I promised Mom I have to. And she didn't like my answer. And she rolled over in bed and like gave me her back, you know. And I thought, okay, that's the end of this conversation. And I left. And when I came back, she was in a coma. And then she died.
Wow.
Within a couple of weeks.
This is very dramatic.
It's very, yes, it was a crazy year. I mean, it's been a crazy 20 years. And that's how the craziness started. So they both wanted to be buried in Lithuania. And I'm in Chicago. My brother's in Los Angeles. And they were cremated. So we had their cremains. We had their urns and cremains. And we flew their cremains to Lithuania in October. And we buried them. And then after that, we were invited to a school. My grandfather has a school named after him. It's a grammar school in northern Lithuania. And the director from that school wanted my brother and me to come and visit his school, the students, and we said yes. And it coincided with my grandfather's 90-year birthday. He would have been 90 years old. It was like this memorial, October 8th. He was born in 1910, and this was October 10, 2000, October 8th, 2000. And so we get there and the children are holding flowers and singing songs and, you know, we're greeted very, very grandly. And then the director takes my brother and me to his office, and the teachers are standing around, and he says, oh, I'm so happy that you took over this book project from your mother. That's such a good thing. You're such a good daughter. You know, it's very important. Lithuania has its heroes, and his story is just so important. And I said, you know, as long as I'm here, why don't you tell me how you named the school after my grandfather? And he says, well, you know, before 1990, we had this horrible Russian name. And we had to get rid of that terrible name. And we had to get a really good patriotic Lithuanian name. And so your grandfather's name came up right away because he was born in this town. And I said, okay, well, that makes sense. But then he said, and he takes me to the side and he says, but you know, I got a lot of grief over naming the school after your grandfather. And I said, why would you get a lot of grief? And he said, because of what the Jews were saying. And I said, what could the Jews possibly say about my grandfather? And he looked at me strangely, like, because I didn't know. Because apparently it's common knowledge there. And he says, well, he was accused of killing Jews. And I said, what? I can't believe it. And that was the first time I had ever heard anything like this. It's the first time. And I was 38 years old then in the year 2000. And I almost fainted right there on the spot. Like I, you know, my heart was beating fast and I had to sit down, and I'm sitting on a chair and, you know, I'm trying to catch my breath, and he's noticing I'm upset. And then he kind of strokes my arm and he says, it's okay. It's okay. It's all in the past. You know, we've all moved on from that. And it's just communist propaganda. It's not true. And I said, okay. So I came back to Chicago, and I started to ask about this. I talked to my father. I'm like, Dad, did you ever hear this? You know, that Noreka was involved in killing Jews. And he said, oh yeah, that's really old information. I'm like, you heard it? I can't believe that you've heard, and nobody told me about this. He said, well, it's not true. Why would we talk about this? And he said, it's just communist propaganda. And I said, oh, okay. And that's how the story started. So from there, I could never let that go. You know, I did go into denial for 10 years. So from 2000 to 2010, I basically told myself it is communist propaganda. I'm sure it's not true. It just cannot be true. And I just started researching all the stuff that my mother left me. You know, at the time I was a journalist and working for all kinds of other publications, 2 children. So this was totally a side project, and I had no deadline or anything on it. Hardly anyone knew I was working on it. And I just sort of kept that horrible news at the back of my head. But because I was a journalist, I couldn't just completely ignore it. I knew that I would have to somehow address it in the book. There was no way I could like not mention it. And so I thought my strategy was going to be to prove that this is not true. And so my mission was to, find exonerating proof that this is completely false. So I started to embrace it that way. And, but then I came across a document that he wrote in 1933 at the age of 22 that is called Raise Your Head Lithuanian. And it was kind of buried in my mother's archives, which is why it took me so long to come across it. And it's 32 pages that he wrote at the age of 22 when he was in the army. And the document basically says, why are there so many Jews in Lithuania? Why do they have all the money? Why are we buying any products from Jews? I say we need to boycott anything that the Jews sell and just buy from Lithuanians. Lithuania is for Lithuanians, not for the foreigners. And it was like this for 32 pages, on and on and on for 32 pages. And I thought, oh my God, this is terrible. And so when I finished reading that document, that was already another doubt in my mind about this. And then I still came across even more damaging information. The worst document that I came across was where he signed in August 22nd, 1941, he signed a document as chair of the Cholet region to send all Jews and half Jews in his region of Cholet to a ghetto in Żagadę. And it didn't take me long to find out what happened to those 2,000 plus Jews in Żagadę. They were brutally slaughtered and murdered in October, like just a few months later, 2 months later. And so that document was the document that really changed my mind about him. And then at that point, I decided to really look into his background. And I noticed that there's very little information about the Nazi occupation in Lithuania. And I thought,
in that region, in that region.
In that region. And so I thought that's strange. And for my grandfather, there's hardly any information about what he did during the Nazi occupation. There's all this on what he did before and what he did after. But there's like hardly nothing that my mother had during those 3 years of the Nazi occupation. And that already was making me wonder, why is it like that? And so I don't know. Another part of the story is that I got another writing degree. I already had a journalism writing degree, and I had been writing this story and getting a lot of rejections from the publishing houses and literary agents. And I thought, wow, I'm not doing something right. And I decided to get another writing degree in creative nonfiction. So I got an MFA in creative nonfiction, and that took me 4 years. And my professors there let me use this as my thesis. So I wrote this as my thesis with them, and they got very excited about this story. And they're the ones who convinced me to write it as a memoir, to write it as my journey of coming to terms with what is going on with my grandfather, and to document it that way. They said that's the only way it's going to really make it interesting. And so it took me a while to understand how to write it that way. My training as a journalist had always been to write things third person and very objectively. And this all of a sudden was to make things very, like, just the opposite, write things very personal, write things with your feelings. So that was a difficult switch for me. And my professor said, write about his heroism, but the main focus of the story needs to be that Nazi occupation and what he did during those years. That is your main focus. Oh, and you have to go to Lithuania. So,
okay.
Go ahead.
Can I cut in?
Yeah, cut.
Okay. So when when Sylvia contacted me, she said to me, this is one of the greatest criminal cover-ups of the 20th century. But at that point, she only knew of the cover-up of her own grandfather. She didn't know about the cover-up that the Lithuanian government was doing on all of the other Nazi perpetrators. So then Sylvia says to me, would I like to read a manuscript? And how do you say it in the title of the manuscript in Spanish? Mi abuelo.
Mi abuelo, el general Storm, héroe de guerra o criminal Nazi.
Okay. So Sylvia, Sylvia, hold that up if you would, please. So Sylvia contacts me and she says to me, would I like to read a copy of her manuscript? Now, as having been involved in this for almost 10 years, I knew the history. So even though she said that to me, I was still really suspicious. So she sends me the English of this book.
Which is the Nazi's granddaughter.
Yes. So I sat down in the living room just right before dinner. And I was like, okay, I'm just going to spend an hour reading this book. And then I'll go and have dinner, and not expecting what that book was. Let me tell you something. I did not get up from that sofa until I finished the entire book. That, first of all, it's one of the best written books I've read. It is absolutely fascinating. Sylvia peels it like an onion. She takes the facts and she takes the frauds by the government and she just peels them back and exposes one fraud after the other. Truly, it's one of the best books I've read in years. I cannot recommend it highly enough. For your viewers, it's an outstanding text, and it exposes government anti-Semitism and government Holocaust denial in a way that I've never seen in any other text.
So Silvia, how do you start writing the book?
I'm sorry?
How did you start the writing? Now you realize that your grandfather...
I had been writing it, honestly, something from the year 2000. it took me like 100 times, literally 100 rewrites. So I never stopped writing. I just kept rewriting and rewriting and rewriting. So it was probably, this is like the 100th version of it. And if it were not printed, I would probably still be rewriting. But what happened is I came back from Lithuania. I went to Lithuania in 2013. And, you know, as part of my trip there, I have a friend who's a journalist here in Chicago, and he worked for the Chicago Sun-Times, and he's Jewish. And he had just come back from a trip from Lithuania called a Holocaust tour. I'm like, what is a Holocaust tour? And he says, this is where you hire a Holocaust guide, and he takes you to all the sites where your relatives are buried. I'm like, oh my God, that sounds horrible. And he says, yeah, but Jews do this, and it's very important to them. And I said, oh my God, I can't believe you did that. Like, I'm like kind of astounded by this. And I didn't even know this was like a thing in Lithuania that Jews do this. And we hung up. And then I kept thinking about this Holocaust tour in Lithuania, how it's just done there. And I kept thinking and thinking about it. And then after a few days, I had a really crazy idea. And I call up Howard again. And I said, Howard, I have a strange idea. My idea is to hire a Holocaust guide and ask him if he would take me to all the death pits where my grandfather was involved in killing Jews.
Yeah. Wow.
And he said, Sylvia, that's a horrible idea. It's so horrible, it's good. And I said, do you think your guide could do this? What do you think? He said, I don't know. I don't think he would, but I'll ask. And he calls up Simon Davidovichus, or he gives me the contact information. It was Simon's email. And I email Simon, and I give him the site. I tell him who I am, and you know who Jonas Nareka is and what I want to do. And he emails me back and he says, I don't know. I don't think so. Let me think about this, but I don't know. And then he took a while, and I can't remember if it was a few days or a few weeks, but he came back and he said, you know what? I've been doing more research on your grandfather, and I think I'd like to do this. I said, really? Are you sure? He said, yeah, I would like to do it. And I said, I think this will take us at least a week. We're going to have to travel through Lithuania together, and it's going to take at least a week to do this. I'm like, okay, whatever. So I had Simon Davidovichus, who he died about 2 years ago.
Long?
But in 2013, he was the director of the Sugihara Museum in Kaunas, which is a very important museum for Jews. Sugihara was a Japanese diplomat who saved many, many Jews by giving them visas to go to Japan.
Yes, he is a righteous
what?
between the nation, no? Righteous.
Yes.
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 But he was Japanese.
Yes.
So I had this big tour with Simon as one of I was there for 7 weeks. I'm a high school teacher. And when my professors told me you need to go to Lithuania and spend a long time there researching, I said, well, I could go only in the summer. So my summer are 10 weeks long, you know, between teaching. And so 7 of those weeks I dedicated to this. And being with Simon was one of those weeks. And I did a whole bunch of other things those other 6 weeks. But that's what we did. Simon took me to a lot of the places where Jews were executed, slaughtered, killed under the orders of my grandfather. He had never done anything like that. And Simon and I, in that week, also became friends. It's just this strange combination. And so that's a big part of my book. The whole thing with Simon is a big part of my book. When I came back, it took me 5 years to finish writing, because I was writing and rewriting. It's a very complicated story. The structure is completely complicated. It took me forever to figure out. So then by 2018, I finally finished it. And at that point, I was ready to find a literary agent, and in the hopes of finding a publisher, a good publisher. Like, I didn't want to self-publish. And I was by myself, carrying this kind of weight the whole time as I'm writing and rewriting. I'm like, I have to get this right. This is such an important story. I can't mess this up. And I would send it out, in the 5 years, I would send it out and I'd get a rejection. I keep sending and rejecting. So I kept sending until I kept rewriting until it was, until it is the way it is. And so I had to get an author platform. Somebody told me, well, another thing is you have to have an author platform. I'm like, what? Like, writing it was not enough? No. So you have to get an author platform. And nobody knew Silvia Foti from any, nobody ever heard of me. And so I got a website. I put a website up, and literally, like, in 1 or 2 days, somebody from Lithuania, a researcher from Lithuania, contacts me, emails me, and says, hello, I'm a researcher in Lithuania. Andrius Kulikauskas is his name. And I'm working for Grant Gochin. Grant Gochin is launching a lawsuit against the Genocide Center of Lithuania for honoring your grandfather as a hero. He wants all those honors stripped, and he's accusing the Genocide Center of Holocaust fraud. And I almost fell off my chair when I read that. Oh, and you should meet Grant Gochin. You two should meet. And I said, I can't believe this. Like, I thought it was just my little family story, which was already more than enough. And now it's turning into like this national thing. And it's true. That was in March, and it took me 6 weeks to get up the courage to email Grant, because I was terrified of emailing. It was like Simon Davidovich all over again. And I was really scared to email him, because what is he going to think of a perpetrator's granddaughter? And Jonas Nareka's, like, he's going to be upset with me. And so that's how it was. I sent him that email that he talked to you about, and then we talked on the phone, and slowly, ever slowly, we started to get to know each other. And now 3 years later, it's like we're on the phone 5 times a day with each other. So so it's been amazing.
It's a whole adventure.
Yes.
And a book is always like this, but now your life is intertwined with the book, and all these feelings. This is why I wanted to ask you. They say some people's terrorists are other people's freedom fighters. There is this idea. When did you take sides? When did you decided, no, this is not the hero? And even if he's my grandfather, he is a killer. How was that? I think it must have been really difficult.
It was very, very difficult, and it was very, very gradual. Even when I read that document that he signed to send all Jews to the ghetto, which is the worst one. We found with Grant's researchers 68 documents like this in the Cholet archives that he either signed or that were sent to him with his name on it. So 68 documents concerning the Holocaust with his name on it. The one I talked about is the worst one. That's the worst one. But there's all kinds of other things there. And I would say little by little by little, like I finished the book and it was still a very internal thing. But I would say once I connected with Grant, I was able to talk about it more. And you know, this is a big trauma for Lithuania. I mean, I know it's a trauma for Jews, that goes without saying, but for Lithuania, this is a big trauma because they don't know about it. Like me, like we just don't know. We just did not know about it. It was hidden. It was purposefully hidden from us.
You see, we Jews do know about it, but the Lithuanians don't, because first the Soviets didn't talk about the Holocaust. And then when Lithuania regained their freedom, they created a whole historical fiction that Lithuanians were just victims and Lithuanians were innocent and everybody else murdered the Jews, but not Lithuanians. And they rehabilitated all of these mass murderers. And you know, from 10 years ago when I started with this, along comes a Jew saying, you know, you've lied to your population so completely, tell the truth. And their lies have been so complete for so long that they actually believe their own lies now. And so along comes this foreign Jew that says, your greatest national heroes were a bunch of Jew murderers. And of course they push back. Now, they've really tried, the government has tried to intimidate us. They threaten me with criminal charges.
Yes.
They, oh, you can't believe what the government does to silence people that are trying to bring truth to light there. And so it is going to be a national Lithuanian trauma, because first, the people of Lithuania will realize how dishonest their own government has been with them. And then they have to learn what their true history is.
But do they want?
And how?
Do they?
No, they don't want to.
They don't want to.
They don't.
It's much better not to know. In this regard, the easy answer is ignorance is bliss.
I know, but the other part is you could think, well, he took orders, right? He took orders and he had to do it because many times this is what the Nazis say. This was an order, I took an order, and it's not what I wanted to do, but I had to do it. Did you apply this to your grandfather?
I tried to, but you know, I found that brochure that he wrote at the age of 22. So that was already bad news. And that was a good 8 years before he wrote that document sending all the Jews to their death. So, and I don't think he changed his mind in between those 8 years. There was a lot of anti-Semitic messages in Lithuania that were sent to them. And, you know, this is evil. I don't know how else to say it. Lithuania was hypnotized by these evil messages, and they believed that all Jews were communists, even the grandmothers and the babies. And somehow they just fell into this horrible lie that was fed to them. And I think it was a mixture of envy of what the Jews had in Lithuania, I think. You know, the centuries old hatred of Jews that has been going on in Europe and maybe the whole world. So,
but you know, in the region where Noreika reigned supreme, there really weren't Nazis posted. And in fact, in the whole of Lithuania, there were under 1,000 Nazis. Now, you can't murder 220,000 people with only 1,000 Nazis. You know, if the Lithuanians didn't want to murder, they could have easily said, these are our neighbors, our friends, our Lithuanian citizens, all we need to do is push back against 1,000 Nazis, but they didn't. It was the Lithuanians that did the roundups. It was the Lithuanians that identified who the Jews were. It was the Lithuanians that did the killing. For the most part, the Nazis stood by and watched. But, you know, the Lithuanian government says, oh, Noreika was just following orders. But he wasn't. He had total power in his region. And these were the things he said before the war that he wanted to do. And then he did them. You know, the world courts have said, you know, somebody else, I was just following orders is not a defense. The Lithuanian government just pulled out all these ridiculous defenses, and they do it. I mean, their latest one is that the US Congress objected to the government of Lithuania using US congressional documents to rewrite Holocaust history. And Congress objected, the US Congress objected. And the Lithuanian government's response is, we know more about the US Congress than senior members of the US Congress, and that they know more about US law than some of the top lawyers, all in the effort to rewrite Holocaust history. I mean, it's a national program in Lithuania that needs to be exposed in front of the whole world.
And Silvia, are you participating into grants efforts to
I am. I support it. I wrote a letter of support to his last lawsuit in Lithuania, and that was one of my rewrites, was to incorporate what the Genocide Center's response to his accusations about my grandfather. So that was part of one of my rewrites that I had to like incorporate at the last minute. But that lawsuit did one big thing, and that put the Genocide Center on record defending my grandfather, why and how. And Grant, I can't remember the name of that group that defended your position, because one of the things the Genocide Center said was that the documents that my grandfather signed were not necessarily signs of him being a participant in the Holocaust, that he didn't really know what a ghetto was for, that, you know, he might have been sending Jews to a ghetto, but he didn't know what happened after that.
Right.
And so the International Holocaust Commission, or whatever it's called, I can't remember the name of it.
Oh, yeah. Oh, yes. There's a Lithuanian presidential commission on the Holocaust and Soviet occupations. And even they came out and said the government's positions are absurd. The World Jewish Congress condemned the Lithuanian government, American Jewish Committee. There were a great many international organizations that came straight out and said the Lithuanian government is committing Holocaust revision, and they don't care. They really do not care. They market to Jews so that Israel will support them militarily, but inside they honor the murderers. I mean, it's terrible. It's absolutely terrible.
Well,
and what Sylvia and I are doing together is to expose it.
Well, I can understand that nobody likes to have a terrible story and this terrible skeleton in the closet, you know.
No, because look at the case of Germany. The Germans came out and said, look, it's absolutely terrible. These are the facts. We're sorry. Let's move forward based on truth. And you know what? Jews all over the world are moving to Germany. Israel and Germany are the best of friends. Jews and Germans are the best of friends. you know, this is a terrible skeleton in the closet, and it's not going to go away until the skeleton's out of the closet. But Germany's shown us that reconciliation is possible. All you need to do is tell truth, and then you can take the next step forward. So what Sylvia and I are trying to get to is get them to tell the truth, and then we can take the next step forward to reconciliation. And there has to be reconciliation because there's no other path forward.
What do you say, Sylvia?
Yeah, you know, the whole purpose of my book is to expose what happened in Lithuania. My grandfather is like a microcosm in one man. He's so symbolic of all the major events that happened during World War II in Lithuania. He did it all, everything in just 36 years. He really was everywhere. And so to follow his life is in so many ways to follow what happened in Lithuania during World War II. And I think that what Lithuania has done today has disassociated itself from the Holocaust. It somehow came up with just excuses. The Nazis made us do it. We had no control, you know, or, you know, so many of us really tried to save Jews. You know, we're a righteous nation. Just anything to not face the truth. And so this disassociation is very unhealthy psychologically. It does cause all kinds of other problems to the organism, and in this case to the nation. And unless Lithuania integrates what happened, even the horrible, what happened, it will never really heal and be a strong democratic country. It has to do that in order to be a true, strong democratic country and have the respect of the Western countries.
Now I have another question. Was there a moment when you said, I'm not writing this book?
Many, like 100 moments, like all the time. I kept putting it down. I'm not going to write it. I'd have a glass of wine or two, and I'd be like, no, I'm not going to do this. And then a few days later, I'd be like, but I wonder, you know, did he do this or did he, like something always, it was like a magnet. Somehow I always had to come back to it and see what happened next, you know. So I tried to stop.
And when your grandmother turned her back to you, what do you think happened in her head at that moment?
I did not know then. At that point, I thought she wanted to spare me this big project because she knew her daughter, my mother, you know, had been under a lot of stress in trying to write this book. And I thought then maybe she was just trying to spare me all the stress. It has been stressful. And, but of course, now I think she knew I was a journalist. And she knew my personality. She did know even then, you know, that if you give Sylvia something to do, she's not usually going to let it go. And God help you if I promise something. So, so she knew. I think she knew I was going to find out, and I think she knew that I wasn't going to treat it the way other Lithuanians would treat this information.
Were you tempted like to write it, my grandfather the hero, and forget about all the dirty stuff, you know?
I was tempted. As his granddaughter, you know, my whole identity was wrapped around my grandfather. He was this wonderful hero, and I had that as part of my identity. And I was so proud of him. But the granddaughter was always fighting with the journalist, you know. And the journalist kept saying, you're going to have to cover this. There's no way you can get away with not mentioning this. And the granddaughter is like, no, please, can I just have my hero? I just want my hero. And the journalist won. The journalist won.
Well, I'm happy. It is very hard, but I like the way the events turn on. Now, tell us a little bit about your message, which I found into Grant's Facebook when you speak with the Jews of Mexico, and you say, "I am now into the same synagogue that was inaugurated the same year." Uh, no, you have the synagogue, Nidchei Israel, which was inaugurated in the same year that the Jews of the original synagogue were killed. This is something amazing, no? This is something so strange.
Yeah, Mexico City has a synagogue called Nije Israel that they built up in 1941. And many of the Jews there escaped or left Lithuania before the Holocaust, luckily. And in Lithuania in 1941, that original Nije Israel was in Šiauliai. And it was bombed by the Soviets, but it was also ransacked by the Lithuanians. And of course, that was right in the middle of the whole Holocaust in Lithuania. So I don't know if my grandfather had anything to do with what happened with that synagogue in Šiauliai, except he was the head of the district there. And so in my message to the Mexican Jews in the Nije Israel, I was trying to be a bridge between the two synagogues, the one in 1941 that was ruined in Lithuania and the one in 1941 that was built up in Mexico City. And if it weren't for people like my grandfather, Jonas Nareka, in 1941, the Jews wouldn't have had to leave Lithuania. They could have been there. So I tried to be like a bridge between the history, the horrible history of Lithuania and the new hope of the Jews who were able to get out.
You know, can I interject for a moment? You know, as a Jew of Lithuanian descent, we come from the most remarkable history of the most remarkably brilliant academics, this unbelievable culture and history, and it was taken from us and destroyed. And you've watched that video. It was the very first time that a Lithuanian stood up and sincerely used the words, "I'm sorry," and acknowledged the crimes. And I have to tell you personally, from my own personal perspective, I have watched that video probably 50 times. And each time I watch that video, I start to cry again. I wish my grandparents had been alive to see the message in that video, because that message that Sylvia delivered was such a healing message. And if we could get to that, then Jews and Lithuanians could have a genuine reconciliation.
I mean, it's like Sylvia is taking the whole feeling. She is restituting the Lithuanian people its honor, no?
Yes.
It's honesty. It's justice. I think she is doing a great act.
It's truth
For the whole
yes.
Lithuanian people. I mean, no matter what the government says, I think they will come to their senses. I hope. But no matter what they do, there is this righteous action to say, no matter what you say, no matter what you put this makeup on the facts, and you want to beautify it, but no matter if it is really my grandfather and it is my blood, but I recognize your suffering. I recognize the suffering of the Jewish people, and I want to make up. I want to restitute justice, and it is. I think, Sylvia, you are the real hero here,
Yes.
and more than your grandfather.
Well, her grandfather wasn't a hero at all, but Sylvia is a hero.
But he is considered a hero
Yes.
in Lithuania, and I think you are, Sylvia, a universal hero now. Because this is the way. This is the way to say there must be justice, and there must be the truth must be told, no matter how hard it is for me, for them, for the whole country, for the Nazis, for everybody. No, the truth must be told.
Well, the true heroes are the victims who died in Lithuania and they were so innocent. Those are the true heroes. And I'm just trying to be a witness to that. It's the least I can do. What they went through was so horrible. There's no comparison. And the least that Lithuanians can do is just acknowledge what happened. That's the least.